My name is Wake Smith. I am a retired aerospace and commercial aviation executive who has returned to my academic roots. I'm affiliated now with both Yale and Harvard, which are the two universities from which I got undergraduate and graduate degrees. And I have become a geoengineering researcher and author and professor. Pandora's Toolbox is my attempt to try to help the world better understand a problem that I'm afraid we are all, or our successors on this planet, are going to confront, and I'm afraid too few people fully understand it. That problem is that the achievement of net zero emissions, which is a goal that the world is increasingly becoming focused on, is likely not to be the end of the climate problem, but merely the end of the beginning of the climate problem. And if we go too far in the direction that we're now going, we will, after we reach net zero emissions, still have a huge overhang of global warming with which we will have to contend. And Pandora's Toolbox is the explanation of why all of that is true, and then a review of the options that the world may have by which to remediate that overhanging climate problem. Differently put, it's the toolbox by which we might repair the future climate. What inspired me to write Pandora's Toolbox is simply the recognition that the world has this problem and it doesn't broadly know it. There's little in this book that is new to science. Science broadly understands this problem, but there is very little in this book that the general public seems to understand. And so I am seeking to help people better understand what we likely will confront, because the world needs to begin to expend much more effort than it has done heretofore to research and develop these tools, and the sooner we get going, the better. Climate intervention is controversial, primarily because people don't understand that we will need it. People are naively hopeful that we will achieve net zero emissions quickly and painlessly, and that will be the end of the climate problem. The problem with all of that is that achieving net zero emissions will in fact be very difficult and very slow and very expensive. And the general public is not yet, with few exceptions, prepared to sacrifice personally to solve the climate problem. We are hopeful that somebody else will solve this problem by being taxed. But there's very little sense that we are going to have to make lifestyle compromises in order to solve this problem. And so what I'm afraid that means is that, again, it's going to be a very slow go. People are thrilled by the speed with which, say, wind and solar and electric cars are moving into the marketplace. What people don't broadly understand is that the proportion of our energy supply that derives from renewable sources has not changed in my lifetime. It is still more than 80% of the world's energy supply that derives from fossil fuels, and the growth of wind and solar aren't yet changing that. So this is a much bigger, slower problem than the world realizes. Moreover, this is what's referred to as a tank and flow problem, where we've got, let's call it a bathtub. There's a spigot coming in, there's a water level in the bathtub, and there's a drain going out. Our greenhouse gas emissions are the equivalent of the faucet coming in. But what informs the global climate is not the flow of greenhouse gases into the bathtub, it's the water level in the bathtub. And so whenever we finally turn that spigot off and get all the way to net zero emissions, which will not happen in my lifetime and will be a huge world achievement, whenever we finally get to that point, the water level in the bathtub is whatever it is, and it will remain at that level for centuries. The natural drain by which the greenhouse gases get removed from the climate system is for all intents and purposes clogged. What I really mean is it's so slow that on a human timescale, we can think of it as clogged. And so the problem is we're continuing to fill the bathtub. And even if we cut our emissions in half, we're still filling the bathtub. And so we have to get all the way to zero before we stop filling the bathtub. And once we get to that point, we now have a level of water in the bathtub, a level of greenhouse gases in the climate system that will be too high for future generations to live with. So after we get to net zero, we will then have to figure out how to drain the bathtub and how to live for centuries with the fact that the water level in the bathtub is too high. And all of that is why we will need climate repair. There is a reluctance among governments and among people to deal with climate intervention, mostly because it's so far in the future that nobody is yet really worrying about it. Unfortunately, the people who will primarily have to contend with this problem are unborn. Most of us who are alive today will not be here when this problem is at its most serious level. And it's very difficult to convince people to undertake sacrifice today for benefit in the future. Very difficult to get people to plant trees, the shade of which they will never sit in. That's a hard problem. And the world is not yet sufficiently alarmed about the climate problem to begin to make those sacrifices. But to be clear, the essential thing to do right now is to move to net zero as quickly as possible. So none of what I'm discussing is a substitute for that. And so long as we're continuing to emit at the rate we are emitting, the essential priority is indeed to cut emissions. So to the extent that the world is beginning to focus on that, that's the right thing and that's a good thing. The problem simply is that once again, that won't be the end of the problem. And there is productive work that we can be doing in this decade to begin to understand and hone the tools that will be necessary to contend with the overhang of climate problems after net zero. They will only take pressure off if people misunderstand what I'm saying. So no, I hope not. It remains essential to get to net zero as quickly as possible. And once again, all of the things that I am discussing are not alternatives to that. We still need to go through that door. It's the only door. The problem, so I'm not peddling alternative fixes to the need to get to net zero. That isn't what this is about. This is about remediation that we will need to undertake after we get to net zero. And P.S., sorry, the sooner we get to net zero, the less large a problem this will be. The sooner we get to net zero, the lower the level of water in the bathtub will be when we finally get there. Pandora's Toolbox is intended to be oriented towards the well-informed general reader. So it derives from a college course and in some sense then is structured like a textbook. It addresses the entire problem from what is climate change and the basics of climate science and what are we doing in the international forums such as the Paris Agreement where these things are being negotiated, and the economics of climate and the energy transition and why that's so difficult. It then goes through the range of ways in which we could cut our emissions, mitigation as it's referred to, and also adaptation, how we can adjust to the warmer future world that is coming. But all of that is merely predicate to the statement that net zero likely will not be enough. And so the core of the book thereafter focuses on what's in Pandora's Toolbox. And broadly, what's in Pandora's Toolbox are tools by which to deal with this climate overhang problem after net zero. But I should clarify, they're mostly not tools, they're cutouts where tools should go in the future. They're outlines for tools that we need, but very few of these tools are in fact on the shelf and ready to go today. But broadly, the tools are segregated into two compartments in our toolbox. On the one hand, there are tools intended to widen the drain in our proverbial bathtub and enable the greenhouse gases to begin to flow out of the climate system much more quickly than nature will do on its own. So all of that is carbon removal of a variety of sorts. That's one compartment. The other compartment is solar radiation management, techniques by which we might reduce the amount of incoming sunlight coming into the climate system and thereby temporarily, but temporarily is decades to centuries, cool the climate while we're undertaking the first thing, which is removing greenhouse gases from the climate system. And so those two types of tools, carbon removal and solar radiation management, might be the way by which the future can contend with this problem. To be clear, carbon removal is penicillin. It would cure the disease. It would solve the underlying problem. The problem is it may take a century or two. After all, that's the time scale on which we've created this problem. It will be 2 or 3 centuries of emissions that will create the problem, and it may take 2 or 3 centuries of removals to solve it. So while carbon dioxide removal is penicillin in respect of this climate disease, solar radiation management is merely morphine. It will reduce the pain that future generations will experience in respect of this climate overhang, but it does not cure the disease. It is merely a palliative to help future generations live with the problem we are bequeathing to them. So once again, it isn't an alternative to emissions reductions. We got to go through that door, but future generations will need other tools beyond emission reductions. After all, once we get to net zero, emission reductions is a spent force. That we can't further reduce emissions. We're already at that point at zero. And if we've still got a problem at that point, then we need tools other than emissions reductions to deal with that problem after net zero. You do not need to be a scientist to read and understand this book. As I earlier said, the breadth of the book is structured as a textbook, but it is written in everyday language. And P.S., I ain't a scientist. I was a history major. So while the book, while through my career, I have done a great deal of management of engineering and operational systems, and I think I am scientifically literate, this is not a book by a scientist, and it is not a book for scientists. But to be clear, there's a whole bunch of science in it. You can't really understand this problem without having some basic understanding of the the science of climate, the science of the emissions problem, and the science that will be necessary to solve the emissions problem. The most surprising thing that people will learn is merely the need for climate intervention in the first place. Most people simply don't understand that this problem will exist. And if there's a single thing that I'm attempting to communicate to the world, it is that a slow path to net zero will mean that net zero is not the end of the climate problem. And that's the context in which the world needs to understand what the rest of the book is about. The technologies that need first and foremost to be developed are those that remove carbon from the climate system, but not from the direct air. The essential thing the world needs to be doing right now this year is removal of carbon from flue gases, from smokestacks. So long as there are smokestacks that are wafting carbon from power plants and industrial facilities and cement making facilities and natural gas refineries and so on, so long as those huge fixed point sources are continuing to belch carbon into the atmosphere, the most effective thing we can do in the climate interventions arena is actually put scrubbers on those smokestacks and prevent the carbon from leaving the smokestack and going into the air. That's the #1 priority amongst the kinds of interventions that I'm talking about that we need to undertake. That doesn't mean it's ahead of electrifying our automobile fleet and so on. All of that needs to be done too. But as far as carbon capture, it isn't capture from direct air that is immediately needed. It is capture from fixed point sources, large fixed point sources. And the reason for that is that a smokestack from a power plant or an industrial facility, the gas going up that smokestack might be 10 to 20% CO2, the bad stuff that we're trying to emit less of. That 5 to 20% compares to 400 parts per million of CO2 in ambient air. So the point is, if we want to catch fish, you go fish where the fish are. The fish are in smokestacks. That's where we've got a high concentration of gases that we don't want to let out into the atmosphere. It's only once we've remediated all of the big smokestacks in the world that we should then start sucking carbon out of the direct air. But eventually, we will need huge industries that are sucking carbon directly out of the air. This is after we've reached net zero. The bathtub is now too full of greenhouse gases, and we need to widen the drain. That wider drain is carbon capture from direct air. And while the world is optimistic that we can do that with trees, we can't. Trees are way too low capacity and fragile places to put our carbon. We've got to take it from direct air, which trees do, but we've got to bury it underground where we got it from when we drilled for oil 100 years ago. Putting it in a tree, which will fall over and rot on the ground in a decade or a century, that in the long haul didn't get us anywhere. So we're going to need late in this century to construct an industry that is in size approximately equal to the size of the entire fossil fuel industry today. All the oil, all the natural gas, all the coal, an industry as big as that to suck all that gas back out of the atmosphere and bury it deep in geological formations where it will stay essentially forever. And the scaling up of that huge carbon capture industry, basically a waste remediation function, that will take trillions of dollars and a century or two to scale up and effectuate. But all of that is absolutely in our future. I don't see any way of getting around that. In fact, even to get to net zero, we will need to undertake huge carbon removals from the atmosphere, because the net in net zero means we're not at absolute zero. It's not that we will have eliminated all emissions. It's that we will have eliminated lots of our emissions, and those that we can't eliminate from agriculture, say, we have to offset those with removals via carbon capture. So even to get to net zero, we're going to need this huge carbon capture industry. And all of the technology for those carbon removals, first from smokestacks and then from direct air, all of that needs to be developed while you and I are still alive. Other things will happen later, but that's an immediate priority. We need a lot of hopes, and this is one of them. It is an utterly necessary intervention, but it is not the whole thing. Once again, none of what I'm discussing is an alternative to net zero. We need to get to net zero, and the sooner we get there, the better. And if, against my prediction, we do get to net zero by mid-century, as all of the giddy talk in Glasgow would urge us to do, if we do that, net zero by mid-century, then we mostly don't need the climate intervention tools that I am talking about. The problem is, I'm afraid we won't get to net zero by mid-century. I'm afraid it will take roughly to the end of this century to get to net zero, if we even do it that fast. And that will mean we continue to fill the bathtub for a much longer period of time, and therefore to a much higher level of greenhouse gas concentrations in the climate system. And if we do that, then we absolutely will need climate interventions, certainly of the carbon removal sort, but likely of the solar radiation management sort as well. And it's that latter sort of climate intervention that brings so much controversy. And I am going to welcome that controversy hereafter, because people misunderstand the purpose of this, and they need better to understand it. The purpose of solar radiation management, to the extent that we need to do it, is not, or at least its proper purpose, would not be to allow people to emit more today and confront the future with a bigger problem. That would be a bad purpose to which to put these technologies. The good purpose, and I think the likely purpose to which the world will apply these in the future, is to relieve the suffering of people primarily in the global south at the end of this century and into the next century, which people had nothing to do with the creation of the climate problem that they will inherit. It's relieving their suffering that would be the best use of these tools, and I think will be the primary use of these tools. So as I've mentioned, there are many problems within Pandora's toolbox. There are technological and scientific problems. There are economic problems. There are governance problems. There are ethical problems. And all of them deserve our attention. It is fully my life now to try to address these problems. And I do worry deeply about the extent to which we are confronting our grandchildren and thereafter with much bigger climate problems than we realize we are confronting them with. But I don't want to end on a hopeless note. The sun still will come up tomorrow. Future generations will find a way to thrive in the problematical future world that we are bequeathing to them. And in all events, Our question today, we can't solve all of those problems in one go. What we can do is move forward in finding solutions to the climate problems that the world will confront. And there are forward steps that we can take. And for so long as there are forward steps, there then can be hope. So what I am seeking to do is better help the world understand the problems that we are creating for the future, in the hope that we can all do a better job then of trying to address those problems and prepare the future for them. Um, Even in a dark situation, we can always add our light to the sum of light.